In the ancient days of Israel, when judges guided the people through times of crisis and liberation, a cry began to resonate with increasing intensity. Observing the neighboring nations with their imposing kings and apparent stability, the Israelites felt a deep need to be like them. "We want a king," they exclaimed to the prophet Samuel, unaware that in asking for a human leader, they were subtly rejecting divine sovereignty. Samuel, a man of unwavering faith, felt the weight of this request. It saddened him that the people desired a king, for he understood that true leadership had always come from God himself. Nevertheless, in obedience to the divine voice, Samuel accepted the mission to anoint Israel's first monarch. And so, in an encounter woven by invisible threads of destiny, Saul appeared. Saul, a young man from the humble tribe of Benjamin, didn't possess the distinction of royalty. He was tall, handsome, and strong, but his life revolved around simple tasks, like searching for his father's lost donkeys. It was in the midst of this everyday chore, far from any pomp, that destiny led him into Samuel's presence. When the prophet laid eyes on Saul, a voice resonated in his heart: "This is the man who will govern my people." Despite Saul's modesty and hesitations, Samuel secretly anointed him, pouring oil over his head. That silent gesture marked the beginning of a new era for Israel, an era of kings and kingdoms. The anointing wasn't just a ritual, it was a transformation. The Spirit of God descended upon Saul with unusual power, preparing him for a calling he didn't yet fully comprehend. Soon after his anointing, Saul remained a man of uncertainties. When Samuel gathered the people to present their new king, Saul, overwhelmed by the responsibility, hid among the baggage trying to evade the weight of his destiny. But he was found and brought before the expectant crowd. His imposing stature and noble presence impressed everyone. "Is this the man the Lord has chosen?" they wondered, and a unanimous cry resonated: "Long live the king!" Although his acceptance was widespread, Saul knew that anointing didn't equate to preparation. However, the opportunity to prove his worth would soon arrive. The Ammonites, ancient adversaries of Israel, besieged the city of Jabesh-Gilead. Their message was cruel: they would surrender, but in exchange, every inhabitant would have their right eye gouged out. The news spread panic and despair throughout Israel. It was then that Saul, still absorbed in his agricultural labors, heard the people's cry. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him with overwhelming force, igniting the latent courage and leadership within him. In a bold and symbolic act, Saul cut 2 oxen into pieces and sent them throughout Israel, accompanied by a warning: whoever didn't join him in battle against the Ammonites would suffer the same fate. The fear of God seized the people, and a vast army gathered. With cunning and bravery, Saul led the Israelites to a decisive victory, liberating Jabesh-Gilead and consolidating his position as Israel's anointed king. The victory against the Ammonites affirmed Saul on the throne, uniting the people under his leadership. However, the true test of his obedience was yet to come. The Philistines, a formidable and organized enemy, began to threaten Israel's borders again. Tension grew, and the fearful people awaited Saul's signal. Samuel had given the king clear instructions. He was to wait 7 days for the prophet to arrive and offer sacrifices to God before any battle. It was a test of patience and faith. Days passed, and the situation became untenable. The Philistine army was approaching, and Saul's terrified soldiers began to desert. The great army dispersed, leaving the king with only a handful of men. Saul's anxiety grew with each passing hour. His army dwindled, the enemies advanced, and Samuel hadn't arrived. The pressure was overwhelming, and Saul, fearing defeat without divine blessing, made a fateful decision. He offered the sacrifice himself. Just as he finished the ritual, Samuel appeared. Seeing what Saul had done, the prophet's disappointment was profound. "What have you done?" Samuel asked sternly. Saul tried to justify his impatience and the pressure of battle, but Samuel was unyielding. He warned him that his disobedience would cost him the kingdom. "To obey is better than sacrifice," he told him, sealing Saul's destiny. Although Saul remained on the throne, Samuel's warning resonated in his mind, but it didn't lead him to deep reflection on his error. The next mission would be even more decisive. God, through Samuel, gave Saul a direct order: completely destroy the Amalekites, an enemy people of Israel. The instruction was clear: annihilate everyone, including King Agag, the animals, and all possessions. There was no room for interpretation. Saul gathered his army and marched against the Amalekites. The victory was swift and devastating. But as the fervor of battle subsided, something in the king's heart began to change. He looked around and saw healthy and valuable animals and King Agag captured alive. The idea of keeping the best of the flock, supposedly to offer as a sacrifice to God, seemed like a sensible solution. Why destroy something so valuable? He thought. When Samuel arrived at the camp, he immediately perceived the disobedience. The bleating of the sheep and the lowing of the oxen were clear evidence. "What is this bleating of sheep in my ears?" the prophet asked sternly. Saul, without hesitation, explained that he had kept the best for God. But Samuel was not convinced. "To obey is better than sacrifice," he firmly repeated. It was then that the judgment upon Saul became irrevocable. God had rejected him as king. Saul remained on the throne, but the Spirit of God that had once guided and strengthened him departed. He felt a growing emptiness, an inexplicable unease. And unbeknownst to him, God had already chosen Israel's next king. Samuel, following divine command, went to the house of Jesse in Bethlehem. There, among Jesse's sons, the most unexpected was chosen: David, a young shepherd of simple and ordinary appearance. However, God saw in David what no one else could see: a heart after his own will. The prophet secretly anointed David, and from that moment, the Spirit of the Lord powerfully descended upon him. Meanwhile, Saul suffered an increasingly intense internal storm. An evil spirit afflicted him, causing constant anxieties that none of his advisors could alleviate. It was then that someone suggested a solution: find a skillful musician to play the harp and soothe the king's troubled spirit. And in a twist that seemed like the work of destiny, David, the young shepherd anointed as future king, was called to the palace to serve Saul. David, with his harp, brought immediate relief to the king. When he played, the evil spirit departed, and Saul experienced moments of peace. Saul didn't know it, but the young man playing to calm his soul would one day take his place on the throne. David would soon distinguish himself for more than just his musical abilities. Amidst the constant threats from the Philistines, a new enemy emerged that terrorized Israel: Goliath, a giant warrior who challenged the Israelites to single combat. For 40 days, Saul's army remained paralyzed with fear. No soldier dared to face him. It was into this scenario that David, still a young shepherd, appeared to bring provisions to his brothers on the battlefield. Hearing Goliath's challenge, he was outraged. How could a man insult the army of the living God and go unpunished? With unexpected courage, David offered to face the giant, relying not on his own strength, but on God's protection. Saul, skeptical, doubted that this inexperienced boy could confront such a feared warrior. But David was determined. He told the king how God had helped him kill a lion and a bear while tending sheep, and he believed the Lord would do the same with Goliath. With no other alternative, Saul allowed him to go, dressing him in his own armor. But David, feeling uncomfortable, preferred to face Goliath with his simple shepherd's tools: a sling and 5 smooth stones. In front of everyone, with just one precisely hurled stone, David defeated Goliath. The victory was so swift and impressive that the Philistine army fled in panic. David's victory over Goliath resonated throughout the kingdom, and his popularity grew rapidly. The young shepherd became the hero of Israel. People cheered him, singing in the streets, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." What initially seemed like a song of praise became an open wound in Saul's pride. The king, who had once seen David as a talented and harmless young man, now viewed him as a threat. Saul couldn't ignore David's growing influence. With every battle victory, with every courageous act, David's name was exalted, while the king's shadow seemed to shrink. Envy began to poison Saul's heart, and the feeling that God had distanced himself from him only deepened this bitterness. From that moment on, Saul began to observe David with suspicion and apprehension. Their coexistence became unbearable. In one of the fits of rage that afflicted him, Saul tried to kill David by throwing a spear at him while the young man played the harp to soothe him. David managed to dodge it, but the danger was evident. Saul no longer trusted him, and the desire to see him dead began to take shape. The king, determined to get rid of the threat David represented, sent him on dangerous missions, hoping he wouldn't return alive. But to his frustration, David always returned victorious, winning even more of the people's hearts. Saul knew he would have to take more extreme measures to eliminate whom he considered his rival for the throne. Saul's obsession with eliminating David grew daily. He could think of nothing else but getting rid of the young man who, in his eyes, threatened the throne. David, realizing the imminent danger, began to flee from Saul. The pursuit extended through deserts, caves, and cities, and Saul mobilized the army of Israel to find and kill David. The pursuit was relentless, but surprisingly, David always managed to escape. In the midst of this flight, There were two moments that could have completely changed Saul's destiny. Twice David had the opportunity to kill Saul, but on both occasions he refused. In the first instance, while hiding in a cave, David and his men saw Saul enter without knowing they were there. Although his men encouraged him to seize the opportunity, David only cut off a corner of Saul's robe as proof that he could have killed him, but chose to spare his life. When Saul learned of this, he trembled, wept, and acknowledged that David was more righteous than him, but this wasn't enough to stop the pursuit. On the second occasion, David again approached Saul while he slept in his camp. One of David's companions suggested killing him, but David refused, saying he would not lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. Once more he spared Saul's life, demonstrating his loyalty to God, even though he was unjustly persecuted. Saul's desperation, however, only increased over time. He couldn't kill David, and the weight of God's abandonment afflicted him more and more. His enemies grew everywhere, and the Philistines prepared a decisive attack. The Israelite army was about to face a crucial battle on Mount Gilboa, and Saul, aware of the gravity of the situation, felt fear growing in his chest. He needed an answer, a direction, but God no longer spoke to him. Not through dreams, not through prophets. Desperate, Saul made a decision that he himself had forbidden in his kingdom. He sought a medium. Disguised, he went to Endor, where a woman known for communicating with the dead lived. Saul knew he was breaking with everything he had stood for as king, but his desperation spoke louder. He ordered the medium to summon the spirit of Samuel, the prophet who had once anointed him. To everyone's surprise, Samuel appeared, but his message was anything but comforting. Samuel's spirit, severe and direct, announced that the battle was lost even before it began. The Philistines would win and Saul and his sons would die on the battlefield. Destiny was sealed. Saul's heart, already afflicted, sank into total despair. He knew his days were numbered, but he still had to face the battle ahead. At the dawn of the battle on Mount Gilboa, the atmosphere was heavy and gloomy. Saul, his heart overwhelmed by the prediction of his own death, led an army that seemed defeated even before raising their swords. The Philistines advanced with force and the army of Israel, without God's favor, began to crumble. Quickly the situation became desperate. Saul's sons, including Jonathan, his loyal heir, died in battle. Saul, seeing the devastation around him, was severely wounded by the Philistine archers. Knowing that capture was inevitable and fearing humiliation at the hands of his enemies, Saul made a final and tragic decision. He asked his armor-bearer to kill him, but the young man, terrified, refused. With no other option, Saul fell on his own sword, ending his life on the battlefield, surrounded by defeat and despair. News of the death of Saul and his sons spread quickly. The Philistines, upon finding the bodies, desecrated Saul. They decapitated him and displayed his head and armor as war trophies. His mutilated body was hung on the walls of the city of Beth-shan as a final humiliation. But, amidst the desolation, a gesture of loyalty still resonated. The brave men of Jabesh-Gilead, who had never forgotten how Saul had saved them years earlier, risked their lives to retrieve the fallen king's body. They brought him back and buried him with honors. Even in his tragic death, Saul received one last act of respect. News of the death of Saul and his sons reached David, who was far from the battlefield. Although Saul had spent the last years persecuting David, trying to take his life at all costs, the young man felt no relief at the king's fall. On the contrary, David's heart was filled with sorrow. Saul had been the first king of Israel, God's anointed, and furthermore Jonathan, his dearest friend, had also fallen in that battle. The pain of loss weighed on him like an immense burden. David, deeply moved, composed a lamentation song that would resonate among the Israelites for generations. In it, he extolled the bravery of both Saul and Jonathan. "How the mighty have fallen," he mourned, acknowledging the virtues of the two men, despite all that had transpired. It was a display of honor and respect that few would expect from someone who had suffered so much at Saul's hands. Even amidst the relentless persecution, David never ceased to see Saul as God's chosen one, someone who, in the beginning, held great promise and potential. David's lament was not merely a tribute to Saul and Jonathan, but also a profound reflection on the end of an era. The nation of Israel now found itself without a king, without clear leadership, and the vacuum left by Saul's death opened the way for the next chapter of its history. With Saul's death, the nation of Israel entered a period of profound uncertainty. The man who had once been chosen by God to lead the people, who began his reign with great victories and the promise of a new era, had now fallen, disobedient and far from divine will. Yet, even amidst his tragedy, Saul left an undeniable legacy. His story, marked by moments of courage and daring, also served as a powerful warning about the dangers of disobedience and pride. David, with the path to the throne now open, observed the shadow Saul had left behind. Saul's reign, though it began with God's blessing, had been tarnished by hasty decisions and a heart that gradually drifted away from obedience. Saul's initial victories were significant, but his inability to fully trust in God and follow his instructions was what slowly led to his downfall. David knew that, as the new anointed king of Israel, he would have to learn from the mistakes of his predecessor. He would need not only to win battles but also to maintain a faithful and obedient heart to the Lord. The transition of power between Saul and David symbolized much more than a mere exchange of kings. It was the dawn of a new stage for Israel, an era that David would have to lead with wisdom, drawing not only from his own experiences but also from the ebb and flow of the previous king's tumultuous reign. Saul, who began with such immense potential, had lost his way. Nevertheless, the future of Israel was just beginning, and with it, profound lessons had to be understood and internalized. The life of Saul reveals a complex and richly nuanced trajectory. He was the first king of Israel, chosen by God, a man who began his reign with humility and impressive victories. There was within him the promise of a strong leader, a man who could have guided Israel through many years of prosperity. However, little by little, Saul allowed insecurity and pride to take root in his heart. His impatience with God's commands and his lack of trust in divine instructions became his greatest adversaries. Each act of Saul's disobedience further distanced him from God, and the throne, which at first seemed to be his true calling, became a heavy, suffocating burden. The power he so desperately sought to maintain ultimately corrupted him, and his misguided decisions brought devastating consequences, not only for himself but for the entire nation of Israel. His relentless obsession with David and the crippling fear of losing his throne blinded him to the stark truth that he had strayed from God's plan long before. The once promising reign, meant to be a beacon of divine guidance, instead became a cautionary tale of human fallibility. The story of Saul serves as a poignant reminder that starting well is undeniably important, but the true test lies in how we finish. Obedience to God is the bedrock that sustains a leader, and without it, even the most promising path can lead to ruin. Saul's life vividly illustrates the peril of allowing pride, envy, and fear to overpower faith and unwavering trust in God. As we reflect on his tumultuous journey, we are reminded that it is not the beginning that ultimately defines our story, but rather the manner in which we persevere in the ways of God, staying true to his divine will. And for David, who now stepped onto the royal stage to assume the throne, this would be a lesson he could never afford to forget, a guiding principle for his own pivotal reign. If this powerful story of Saul has touched your heart and inspired you to continue exploring the paths of faith, we warmly invite you to like this video and share it with all your loved ones. Faith is meant to be shared, and you can play a crucial part in helping us bring God's message to thousands of hearts. All you need to do is subscribe. It's completely free, but for us, it means an immense amount. It empowers us to continue creating content that keeps the word alive and transforms lives. Join us on this vital mission and don't miss the upcoming stories that will undoubtedly change the way you see and understand the Bible.